TO-5 is the newest in Oberheim's series of polyphonic synths. It sits at the entry level of their range, price and polyphony-wise, but in terms of features and modulation, it bypasses its bigger brothers in many ways. In this video, I'll take a look at its features in depth and the pros and cons compared to other synths in general, and synths by Sequential and Oberheim more specifically. At the end of the video, I'll play you over 30 of its 250 presets, and I'll upload quite a few multi-samples to my Patreon so you can get a taste of playing it on your computer or sampler. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Sequential/Oberheim sent me TO-5. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview. TO-5 is a 5-voice polyphonic synth with analog oscillators, Thru Zero FM and SEM filter, and digital modulation, control, and effects developed in collaboration with synth pioneer Thomas Elroy Oberheim, hence TO-5. It's made by Sequential, the company founded by legendary Dave Smith, and if it looks quite familiar, it's because it's based on the same platform as Sequential's Take-5. I don't have one to compare directly, but it looks like the digital aspects are more or less similar, and the main difference is in its heart, the central analog section, oscillators, cross-mod, and filter. I'll talk about how TO-5 compares to other synths in the Sequential/Oberheim lineup in the pros and cons, but probably the biggest difference between TO-5 and Take-5 is that Take-5 has a single-mode 24 dB per octave 4-pole low-pass filter that can self-oscillate, whereas TO-5 has a 12 dB per octave 2-pole state variable filter that doesn't self-oscillate but can morph from low-pass to high-pass through either notch or bandpass mode. There are also some differences in the oscillators, which I'll talk about in a bit. Besides that, both synths have 2 LFOs and 2 envelopes, though I haven't compared the curves, so those may be different. A 19-slot mod matrix, an arpeggiator and simple sequencer, Unison and portamento, and plenty of preset storage, 256 factory presets with a sequenced pattern for each preset, and another 256 slots for user presets. On the effects side, both have 3 global effects, an overdrive, a single effects slot that can be configured between a number of options, and then a reverb. Both synths are very hands-on with plenty of knobs and buttons for various functions, but you can unlock plenty of functionality hiding either in the mod matrix or in the program menu, as well as the global menu, which also has additional controls. The build of TO-5 feels very solid. There's no wobble in the knobs and their control feels excellent. The top and bottom of the enclosure is metal. The sides are plastic, but feels solid too. The screen is small, but I guess adequate as it doesn't show too many parameters at a time. It's OLED and has great viewing angles. The keybed is semi-weighted and feels pretty good to me. The keys are both velocity sensitive and have channel aftertouch with a good degree of control. Channel aftertouch means that pressure is detected with a single value for all the keys, regardless of which key you apply pressure to, as opposed to some new keybeds with polyphonic aftertouch, where pressure detection is per key. The keybed has 3.5 octaves, which is a bit limiting for a polysynth. However, it comes with an interesting low split mode that lets you choose a split point, say over here, and then split the keyboard from that point on, either 2 octaves or 1 octave down. This doesn't make the synth bitembral, but it does extend the keyboard's range, assuming you don't need the notes in the middle. In terms of connectivity, you've got a headphone output and 2 1/4-inch outputs, unbalanced unfortunately, and then an expression and sustain pedal input. Then you've got MIDI in, out, and through. Power is IEC, so no need for an adapter, which is great, and there's a USB Type-B port, which works for sending MIDI back and forth, as well as pairing with the optional third-party editor. TO-5 being an analog synth means that you need to calibrate it every now and then if you feel like it's getting out of tune. I found that I needed to do this a couple of times when I first got it, and then much less later on. And regardless, calibration is a relatively quick process, takes a couple of minutes, and it's all done automatically. Okay, that's it for the overview. Let's dive in and start with the oscillators. The oscillator section has two main oscillators, a sub-oscillator, and a noise generator. You start an init preset, by the way, like this. And eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed with concern that there's no mixer section for the various oscillators. You can only turn them on or off. However, no worries, you can edit their level with a long press and turning the screen encoder. The level of the oscillators is also separately addressable in the mod matrix. Each of the oscillators can generate three shapes: saw, square, or triangle, and you can combine them. There's no morphing between the shapes like on take 5, but I actually prefer to be able to combine any shapes that I like as opposed to morph between a set series. These combinations can change the timbre of your sound. So for example, a saw and triangle will make it deeper and bassier, but a square and triangle actually reduces bass. The pulse width knob changes the pulse width for both oscillators. Oscillators 1 and 2. But you can change the pulse width individually by holding the oscillators button and changing either oscillator 1 pulse width or oscillator 2 pulse width. There's no direct pulse width modulation control, but making an assignment is pretty easy. You just hold the destination button of one of the LFOs and turn the pulse width knob, then choose the amount. Unlike Take 5 and many other synths, coarse tuning uses one knob over the range of 5 octaves for both oscillators. And then detune is just for a slight detune of oscillator 2 relative to oscillator 1. That's the one place where I prefer to have two knobs, one for octaves and another for finer control, but not as fine as semitone detune. Besides the two oscillators, you've got a sub-oscillator, square, and then a noise generator that can be either white noise or can be changed to pink noise in the program menu. Let's move on from the oscillators and talk about the cross mods. You've got oscillator sync, which resets the cycle of oscillator 1 based on the cycle of oscillator 2. For that to sound good, you don't need to hear oscillator 2, but its frequency needs to be lower than the frequency of oscillator 1. So don't forget that. And it sounds steppy now because this knob is quantized, but when modulated, it's smooth. And then there's Thru Zero FM or Thru Zero Cross Mod. This is oscillator 2 modulating the frequency of oscillator 1, so you don't need to have it on to hear the effect of the modulation. And if we head out to the OBX8 for a second, the problem with regular Cross Mod, regular FM, not Thru Zero, is that it messes with the tuning of the oscillator. It sounds cool and metallic, but it's hard to keep it in tune and play it chromatically. And back to TO5, notice as we increase mod depth, we get the metallic timbres without a pitch shift, at least not in the beginning. Maybe it does at the extremes, but it keeps pitch throughout a nice portion of the range. Crossmod always selects the triangle waveform of oscillator 2 as the source, regardless of what you pick here. And then the effect of crossmod will be depending on the waveform of oscillator 1. So for a more tame crossmod, pick triangle as the destination waveform of oscillator 1, and if you're open for more craziness, combine shapes or pick other shapes. And then the frequency ratio between the two oscillators matters. So let's go back to the tamer triangle. Crossmod or Thru Zero FM will sound good or bad based on whether there's a harmonic ratio between the two oscillators. And there are plenty of timbral sweet spots to explore here. both when oscillator 1 is at a higher frequency than oscillator 2 and the other way around. Now things start to get interesting when you modulate cross-mod depth. Cross-mod is kind of like the opposite of a filter. It adds harmonics as you increase mod depth. Let's check out this preset. Again, very bell-like and quite playable. I know this one is also Thru Zero FM gives you timbres that you just don't get from subtractive synthesis. And again, being Thru Zero makes it very playable. And I really like how in this patch they use velocity and cross mod to get this shamisen-like sound. Before we bid farewell to the oscillator section, there are a few hidden features in the program menu. You can turn key tracking on or off for either of the two oscillators. You can detune oscillator 1, not just oscillator 2 on the panel, and you've got per oscillator glide as well. And this may be more related to the filter, but you can also choose to have oscillator 2 bypass the filter. So speaking of which, let's talk about the filter. The filter is a 12 dB per octave 2-pole SCM filter. Increasing resonance doesn't reduce the bass, which is a good thing. There's no pre-filter drive like on take 5. It doesn't self-oscillate, but it can get nicely crunchy. And this filter has the superpower of morphing. From low pass through notch to high pass with resonance on each. So that's the default behavior, and if you want, you can also have it morph through a bandpass, which is something you need to choose in the menu. So now you've got a bandpass in the middle through to high pass. Add noise. You see this in action. Bandpass here, and with resonance. So nice resonant peak here, morphing through the 3 states. Now, while the filter doesn't self-oscillate, you can actually ping it and it'll ring. So this is what it sounds like. I'll turn off the effects, though of course it sounds better with. What I'm playing now is the filter, along with the oscillators pinging it, and then moving on to something completely different, even though it's a 12 dB per octave filter. With a bit of tweaking, I think it can sound quite 303-ish. And there's a preset that takes it to an extreme. Okay, let's talk about the effects, and I'll start with the overdrive. I'll just run a few factory patterns through it. Let's take a listen. Let's try one more. So nice crunch to be had there. Then you've got 2 effects slots. Let's start with a reverb. Dry wet mix, size, pre-delay, and decay. along with a very important tone control to take off the highs or lows. So the reverb can get nice and long if you want it. There's no fancy stuff like a shimmer. Anyway, that's the single reverb slot. And then this slot has quite a few effect types. The first 4 are delays, and the first 2 are stereo delays. But you won't hear the fact that they're in stereo unless you start panning the voices in your patch. So quick preview into the mod matrix. Just find an empty slot, choose voice spread, point that to panning, and then increase mod depth. And then I'll turn off Unison for this patch. And for this first delay, you can hear only the first tap is in stereo. Then there's the Bucket Brigade delay. This one, besides being a BBD emulation, is a true stereo ping pong delay. So it'll keep pinging and ponging back and forth beyond the first tap. But again, only if you send it a patch that has pan modulation. I think there should be a shortcut that generates this kind of stereo spread. Then there are 2 more delays which aren't stereo. Tape. And another tape. One more thing about the delays, they can be tempo synced or not. I wish they'd show you delay times on screen, by the way. Let's move on to the chorus. For that, I'll reduce stereo spread because we want to hear how good it is. Let's turn the effect off first. So this is our raw tone without chorus and with chorus. Again, the parameters aren't labeled and they don't appear on screen, but this is the chorus rate, depth, and low pass cutoff. Nice chorus, I think. Let's move on to the flanger. This is feedback, depth, and rate. Phaser, rate, depth, feedback. Then there's a simple high-pass filter, frequency, mix, resonance. Again, it would be useful if these parameters were shown on screen as you change them. And then there's a distortion, more aggressive than the drive. Tone control, output level, and gain. Nice distortion, I think. Then there's ring mod, again, raw tone, and with ring mod, frequency, mix, and pitch tracking. Then there's a rotating speaker, speed, drive, mic distance. And last but not least, lo-fi, frequency control, wow and flutter, and drive. So those are the effects. Let's check out Unison mode. You've got up to 5 voices of Unison. While the vintage knob will loosen up Unison, There's also a detune, Unison detune function in the menu. And then the Unison button also gives you access to the chord mode. You just hold a chord and press Unison, and that becomes the active chord. While we're here, there's also portamento. Our oscillator glide and legato are in the program menu. And we can move on to talk about modulation. Let's start with the envelopes. You've got 2 envelopes with ADSR controls on the panel, as well as a mount control. So if we want to set up a filter envelope, that's pretty easy to do. With mod depth control here, bipolar, and adding velocity sensitivity is as easy as pressing these buttons for the filter or for the amp. Very useful. And then like the Take-5, you've got an option to quickly toggle the routing between a few envelope routing options. Basically what this does is disconnect this envelope, envelope 1, from the filter and call it an auxiliary envelope, and then have the filter be controlled by the ADSR envelope along with the amp, or have this just control the filter and have the amp in gate mode. So now say we can have this control the filter, which frees up this to control something else. And this assignment is made in the mod matrix in the last slot. We'll get to this a bit later. The main thing that's important to know for now, regardless of the mod matrix, is that when you're in auxiliary mode, this now controls auxiliary envelope mod depth as opposed to the filter envelope mod depth. Beyond the on-panel controls, you've got a few program controls for the envelopes. You've got a 5th or 1st delay stage for both envelopes if you want, and you can have the envelopes repeat. So this is our amp envelope, envelope 2, and we can have it loop if we want. Let's init this patch and move on to the LFOs. You've got 2 of them. Again, same configuration as the Take-5, just different buttons and a different layout. LFO 1 is mono, as it's called here, meaning a single LFO applied to all the voices at once. And LFO 2 is polyphonic, meaning you get 5 copies of this LFO, 1 per voice, and each can be running separately at different rates or phases. Just like the envelopes, you can make LFO assignments in the mod matrix, but there's one quick assignment. So say, if I wanted to assign this LFO to the pitch of oscillator 2, making the assignment is as quick as that, and then I can change the mod depth, change the shape, all directly from the panel. You've got the typical 5 basic shapes, and frequency control. LFOs go up to 500 Hertz, so nice FM here. There's no fade in or out for the LFOs, so you'll need to create that with an envelope. And beside the on-panel controls, you've got a few goodies in the program menu. You can slew, meaning smoothen out, either LFO 1 or LFO 2. It's more obvious, I think, with sample and hold. So without slew, changes are very sharp, and with slew, smoother, which is cool. And then you can also reset the phase of the LFOs with every note press. Okay, let's move on and talk about the mod matrix. I'll start with an init patch, and let's take a look at the mod matrix. It's populated by default with a few assignments. As you can see, pressure is assigned to the filter cutoff. Anyway, you've got 16 of these slots. You can see that the mod wheel is assigned to LFO1 amount, and then beside the 16 slots, you've got 3 more that are controlled directly by the mod depth knobs on the panel. In this case, LFO1 is set by default to vibrato for all the oscillators. Again, it starts at 0, but the mod depth is controlled as we saw previously in this slot. Then the second slot is for LFO 2, second dedicated slot. And then the third dedicated slot, or the 19th slot in total, is for when we've got envelope 1 in auxiliary mode, again, just for the purpose of controlling mod depth with this knob. You can still assign envelope 1 to any other destination in any one of the other mod slots. So I could choose envelope 1 here and assign that to whatever I want. Speaking of assignments, you've got quick assignments using the source and destination buttons, so you don't have to scroll through parameters if they've got a knob on the panel. So for example, if I wanted to create a slot where the mod wheel or the pitch bend wheel controls something, say for example, if I wanted to pitch bend to open up the filter, then I would simply do that and set a mod depth. And now the pitch bend wheel will also control the cutoff. You can also make quick assignments using the keyboard with this, so just hit source and toggle between velocity, pressure, and note number. Now you'll notice that sometimes there's either an M or a P next to a source or a destination. P means a polyphonic source or destination, and M means a monophonic source or destination. Besides sources and destinations on the panel, there are quite a few to explore in the menu. For example, voice spread. We used that for panning previously. And breath or foot controller. Note number. Filter output. I guess that's an audio routing of the filter output. Let's see what happens. Not much. Oh, okay. Interesting. So that's a nice timbral cross mod to explore. Saying goes, by the way, for destinations, there are quite a few interesting ones to explore here. I think over 60 of them, including, like I mentioned earlier, mod slot depths. So if you wanted to have an envelope control the depth of an LFO modulation, or to have the mod wheel or expression pedal do that, then that's how you make those things happen. And then vintage mode is kind of a mod source too. So this is the patch as is. If we lower vintage down, you can hear the oscillators are pretty much in sync, and the multiple Unison envelopes are also doing their thing together. But as we crank up vintage, the oscillators will start to be a bit out of tune, in tune, out of tune, and the envelopes doing their own thing at their own rate. Again, as opposed to this. So vintage is a fun way to loosen things up a bit. Let's move on and talk a bit about the arpeggiator and sequencer. The arpeggiator is very much hands-on. We've got a few modes. Up, and down, which is Stranger Things mode. There's a hold for it. Random. And assign, which is order. You can spread up across up to 3 octaves. And add repeats. Up to 3 repeats. And then there are a few program options here as well. By default, the arpeggiator is in relatch mode, meaning if you play a chord in hold mode, and then play a different chord, it'll swap the chords. But if you go into relatch mode off, then it basically acts like a sequencer. You can play a chord, but any subsequent notes you play will be added to that chord. So it's kind of like a real-time monophonic step mode. And then final arpeggiator thing, just trust me, turn ARP beat sync to quantize if you want clean in rhythm chord changes as opposed to immediate chord changes. Then beside that, you've got a very basic sequencer. You hit record and can record a few notes. You can also record chords and use program to add a rest or tie with right. And I have no idea what, but this is what we get. And 2 cool sequencer features. Let's just sequence this. You can play on top of a sequence and also transpose it by holding record. So middle C is no transpose. And once you've transposed it, you can play on top of that. With the voices you have left. That's pretty much it for the sequencer. There's no automation and no live recording, but sequences are saved with presets, which is cool because as you go through the factory patterns, you have a little pattern to demo each of them. So that's it for the synth standalone. It doesn't come with any companion software, but a third-party company called SoundTower makes a software and plugin companion to it. I tested the software a bit. It works quite nicely. As you change presets, the presets will change on screen. The app stays in sync. If you change a parameter on the synth, it'll change on screen and vice versa. You can get a quick glance at parameter values and mod matrix assignments. It's also much faster to rename your presets this way. And if you're hunting for ideas for new sounds, there are quite a few tools to help you do that, including my favorite, the preset morpher. Now this can be hit or miss, so you never know what you're going to get. I'll just pick something randomly. Let's maybe choose this preset here and this preset here, and try and morph between them. So all these sounds live between those two. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons for TO-5. On the pros side, I think, is just how it sounds, and you can judge for yourself whether this is something you like or not. I'll play you several dozens of its factory presets at the end of this video. It's not as diverse as a synth with wavetables, samples, or other forms of digital synthesis, but within the scope of what it does, I think it does it very well. The raw ingredients here are excellent as expected from Sequential and Oberheim. The stars of the analog show are the SCM multi-mode filter with its morphing variable states. It's Thru Zero FM bringing in new harmonics and making them more playable with Thru Zero compared to linear or logarithmic FM. And then if you want to dig deeper, the 19-slot mod matrix and various audio rate and non-audio rate cross mods will keep you busy. And the low split mode is an interesting and good way to make more use out of a 3.5 octave keyboard. And then on the cons side, while TO-5 is on the lower end cost-wise in the product line, you're still paying a premium for the analog guts of this synth. So it really depends how important that is to your ears when compared to all the digital alternatives like Hydrasynth, Modwave, even MiniFreak on the lower end. Also with an SEM filter, by the way. All these may not sound exactly the same, but they are more timbrally diverse. Then if you do decide that this is the sound you want, probably the biggest limitation that I felt here is the fact that TO-5 only has 5 voices. Now it doesn't matter much if you're playing an arpeggiated pattern or a sound with a short release, unless you really want to jazz it up with more than 5-note chords. But if you're playing those lovely long Oberheim style long release tones, you'll start to cut out voices if you play more than 5 notes. That's where you need to start managing how you play. Say, for example, if I wanted these bass notes not to be cut off, when I play more notes, then I need to hold them, then let these notes cut out each other as these ring out. So voices will run out much faster than, say, on an 8-voice or 16-voice synth, of course. Then another thing you need to be aware of is that this is a single timbre synth, meaning no splits with different sounds or layers with 2 different sounds. And then beside that, I have a few cons that might be fixed in a firmware update. While there are plenty of knobs and buttons on the interface, there are also quite a few interesting parameters in the program menu. So my suggestion is that just like the bank button is used as a shift to choose different banks, let us use the bank button, say, to turn on bandpass mode here, or maybe bank plus attack would address the delay stage in the envelope. Bank and Unison could increase, say, the stereo spread, just to make the workflow a little bit faster. I also think bank should be used to transpose the pattern. Right now it's record, but if you hit record to transpose the pattern and then change your mind, it'll just stop the pattern. Another little firmware request, it would be great to see parameter values as I move the knobs, especially for effect parameters when you're controlling effects where the labels aren't related to what the knobs do. And then final little quirk, the knobs don't work when you're in global mode. I think they should. And then comparing this to other synths in the Oberheim/sequential line, I already talked about the differences between this and Take 5, especially this section here. The rest is pretty similar. And then there's the OB6. It's much more expensive. You get a few more keys and a sixth voice. It also has effects, but significantly fewer modulation options, no Thru Zero FM and no OLED screen, which I think is important to make your way around preset names and parameter changes. Also, on TO-5, you don't need to give up an oscillator to get a polyphonic LFO. I'm not sure what the price for TO-5 will be at the time you're watching this, but if it's in the ballpark of Take 5, then TO-5 gives the OB6 a serious run for the money. Then there's the OBX8. It has 8 voices going for it, which, like I said earlier, matters, and bitemporality, but its focus is fidelity to the original Oberheim synths, which means no effects, no multi-slot mod matrix, and no morphing filter, as well as regular FM as opposed to Thru Zero FM. I put them side by side and opened up the It's an Oberheim preset on both. They didn't sound the same out of the box, but I twisted some knobs until they were close enough. Note that the patches are velocity sensitive, so that matters too. If there's a lot of interest, I'll make a more detailed comparison, but I think overall the other differences I mentioned set them apart more than the difference in sound, at least based on these simple tests, and the very large difference in price. So bottom line, if you want an analog synth with plenty of modulation options and effects, and the Oberheim sound and a lovely SEM filter, and the low voice count isn't an issue, then TO-5 is well worth considering. Stay tuned for the presets, and you'll find quite a few TO-5 and OBX8 multi-samples on my Patreon, along with my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.